Hi, and welcome to my developmentally appropriate practices presentation. So, my name is Regan Moore, and currently I'm working at Irma Middle School. I teach sixth grade science. My students are 11 to 12 years old, and because of that, they're really in transition between middle childhood and early adolescence, and a lot of that transition happens in sixth grade. This is my seventh year teaching middle school and my third year teaching sixth grade. So, in thinking about physical development, I chose to focus on middle childhood physical development features because that's where they start. But at each one of these, I'll talk a little bit about how they grow as well. So, over the last several years, they've had some slow, steady growth, whereas when they hit sixth grade, they're going to eventually hit a growth spurt as well. And usually it's the girls who hit that growth spurt first. They have most of their permanent teeth. However, in sixth grade, we are still sometimes losing teeth. Their brains have developed in terms of attention, spatial orientation, speech, language, and reading. And there is specialization of different areas of their brain happening at this time. Those specialized areas are starting to integrate with each other, which then enhances their ability to think about multiple things at the same time. Their movement and capacity for movement and coordination has developed greatly. They need a lot of physical activity and are starting to play organized sports. As they move into early adolescence, they become slightly awkward again as different parts of their body grow at different rates. So, in middle school, their fine motor skills are pretty well developed. They have handwriting, drawing, cutting, and craft work down pretty well. But at the beginning of sixth grade, again, we're still struggling with some of those things. So, we're still seeing some sloppiness and some inability to use fine motor skills. Gross motor skills have improved greatly, so they're able to run faster, jump, throw things. They have greater agility, but also they've been able to coordinate all these body parts as well. So their coordination has improved as well. So, in terms of developmentally appropriate activities, I chose to focus on the ones that allowed students the greatest physical mobility. That's one of the biggest things that we see in sixth grade is that they have this need to exert physical energy. So, the three activities the first one is Oh Dear, and it's a game that students play that represents or simulates population changes based on resources within an ecosystem, and they actually act out these population changes. And as they're acting them out, they actually get to run across a big open field. But more importantly, they see how lack of resources affects population, and when population increases, number of predators increase, and then it reverts back to resources again. Um, the second one is a water cycle game in which students move around the classroom and are simulating being a droplet of water or a molecule of water as that molecule moves through different phases of the water cycle. And the last activity is a koosh ball review. This is a activity in which students are able to throw a koosh ball at the smart board trying to hit different size circles on the smart board. Those circles represent points and questions that the students can answer and get points for. So it's essentially like a physical form of Jeopardy. The students love this because they get to throw something at the smartboard, but also they're using their hand-eye coordination to try to hit different sized circles and gain points. So in terms of cognitive development, um, in this realm, I chose to focus more on early adolescent cognitive development because this is where I feel like my sixth graders are a lot as they're coming to me as well. They are really moving from concrete operational thinking into formal operational thinking. So being able to create hypotheses, think logically and abstractly about things. is something that I'm really starting to see from them even when they first come to my classroom. They're able to consider multiple perspectives. They're starting to recognize symbolic representation. They're thinking about their thinking and understanding the way they think. They are working on decision making skills, though most of them are emotional decision making skills right now. This is due to a heightened reward stimulus. And so they're weighing risk versus reward, and they need a lot of adult support through that to model decision making practices. Um, and they have a lot of influence by their friends when it comes to decision making. They are working on motivation or lack thereof based on self esteem and looking for autonomy and a little bit more control. The picture to the right is a picture of Irma Middle School's science team, and I chose this picture because I feel like it represents a lot of these cognitive development milestones. Again, the students are moving into that formal operational thinking, which is something required for science, symbolic representation, but also giving them the motivation and the self esteem that they gain from being able to choose to join something like a science team kind of gives them that positive self image that we'll talk about, that identity that we'll talk about as we move into social emotional. So, Jean Piaget's stages of cognitive development are very important in this aspect because Jean Piaget really shows 4 different stages. And this is what I was talking about, the concrete operational moving to formal operational for 6th grade students. The concrete operational is thinking logically about concrete, tangible things, and the ability to understand the conservation of numbers, mass, and weight. Moving into formal operationals where they are able to think abstractly, systematically, generate hypotheses and theories, and able to plan and strategize. So in terms of 6th graders, because they are entering that early adolescence, they're still making that transition. It's important for me as a teacher to provide differentiated instruction for my students who are still at that concrete operational stage, but also still challenge those that are already moving on to formal operational thought as well. Piaget's constructivism theory also plays a big part in 6th grade learning. Piaget thought that learning happens in cycles. So children have an idea of how they think something works or a schema. And when they're presented with contradictory evidence or an experience, they experience themselves disequilibrium or confusion or idea that doesn't fit in with that schema. The children then have to accommodate for that new information, which allows them to return to equilibrium, and then they assimilate that new learning into an altered schema. And every time they're presented with new information that puts them at disequilibrium, the cycle starts over. So in terms of activities or strategies that would really target 6th grade students based on their cognitive development, the first one I've got here as an example is the Conservation of Energy Lab. So I give the students a Newton's cradle that they can play with. And one of the things that they notice is that the energy is transferred from one side to the other and back again, and it could go on and on and on. This puts them at disequilibrium, and then they have to try to reason through and figure out what's happening with the system, and then they accommodate their schema for energy transformations as they understand that the energy is conserved through the system. The next one is science fair projects. So because students are able to start creating hypotheses and theories and think and plan out investigations, they're given a chance to do that. And then they can observe and analyze data and draw conclusions from that real data. So we still have some evidence, and then they're able to present that evidence. Finally, the plant in the jar is where students actually observe a plant growing inside a jar, and the jar is sealed so no air can come or go. Well, students already have a pretty good idea about what happens to living things without fresh air. So, as we move through this, we make a hypothesis about what we think is going to happen to the plant. We collect data over several weeks, and the students actually see that the plant is still living weeks and weeks into this experiment. So, they have to adjust their schema for living things to understand what plants do with different gases. So, Albert Bandura's social learning theory really is all about the way students observe something in their environment um, and then are able to replicate that same thing. So, learning comes from model and behavior outside of the student. So, we're seeing a model for behavior, we're making some observations, and then students are able to incorporate that into their new learning. In terms of sixth graders, because they're developing their emotional decision making, it's important to model positive behavior as well as cognitive processes in decision making. So, walking through decision making steps for the students as a model so that the next time that they're making a decision, they can use some of those same strategies that they've seen modeled for them. I chose the picture to the right because I'm making a silly face in the camera, and immediately I've got two other girls who are mimicking that modeled behavior. So I thought it was just very expressive of Bandura. Some strategies or activities that I have for Bandura are diagramming models. So when I do notes in class or do models and drawings, I use a document camera, and I have a notebook that I write just like the students do. It's exactly the same. And they are not required to write exactly what I write word for word. However, they're using my notes and my drawings and the way I label things to organize their thinking. And I'm modeling that behavior for them. I'm modeling note taking strategies for them so that as they progress through middle school and into high school, they know how to think about things and know how to take notes. Um, Also, I do heterogeneous grouping in my class for table groups. So this is the seats they sit at every day. And they're grouped together, usually in groups of 3 or 4. But I change those seats periodically. But when I do, and when I make a group, a heterogeneous group for seating, for table groups, I make sure that at each table I have a variety of skills and ability levels so that students can learn different skills from each other, because we know that they are also modeling for each other on a daily basis. And finally, when I assign a project or an assignment, I usually also provide students a model of excellence. So, for example, in an endangered species project that I do each year, I go through and walk through the whole project with the students um, with a great white shark, which is the only endangered species that they are not allowed to use for their project. But by doing that, it shows them the complexity and how in depth I expect their research to be, what exactly I'm looking for when I talk about habitats and resources. What is it that I want them to look at for their animals? So they have a model of excellence that they can use so they know exactly what to do for the project. So Vygotsky's theory on sociocultural development really has to do with the social norms and the cultural experiences that a child has are what's going to develop their cognitive understanding and ability. So, for example, a child who's grown up in Western culture and has a propensity for written math and understands written math very well might be pretty well different from, say, a Brazilian child who has been selling candy on the streets and has a propensity for mental math and can process mental math very quickly. It depends on the culture and the experiences that you've had, and those really work to gear the cognitive development for the child. So what we know from Vygotsky is for sixth graders is that they need a lot of adult interaction in their life. They need a lot of social and cultural experiences, and that those are going to play a huge role in developing them cognitively and help them learn how to balance reward versus risk. So the more we can support them as adults, the better off they're going to be. So a few strategies I have that will tap into that need for adult and cultural assistance is that I have differentiated instruction. I have differentiated instruction that will work at a child's zone of proximal development. And that makes sure that students are working exactly where they need to be. So the zone of proximal development really shows what students are able to do on their own, what students are working on currently, and then where they're headed next. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But by providing leveled reading materials, working in small pull-out groups, and working on specific skills, I can ensure with my close working with them that they are working exactly where they need to be. I can also use assessments, formative assessments. Those will help me understand a student's mastery of a particular indicator or not. And then if not, where are they struggling? So using those formative assessments will help me make sure that they are working towards mastery. Finally, peer tutors, because Vygotsky asserts learning is social, peer tutors can help promote positive cognitive development for students and also normalize between students of different skill levels and at various stages. So here's a model of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So again, it really looks at what students are able to do alone without any assistance from an adult. And then where they need actual guided practice or scaffolding from an adult, and then where they're headed to, what their future skills are that they plan to or that they will be able to eventually master. And that you can't move up to those future skills without mastery of what's in their zone of proximal development. So for sixth graders in the zone of proximal development, sixth graders are cognitively working on considering problems from multiple perspectives and using logical, systematic thinking. As they progress into that area, they're going to need scaffolding and support from adults to help build that inner speech, that inner monologue, and aid in their problem solving. Now, scaffolding is the way that adults can support children as they build their own knowledge. So thinking about scaffolding being like what's around a building as you're building a building. It's what's going to support the building until it is built. And that's kind of the way adults work with kids to help them achieve the next cognitive skill or ability. So Skinner's theory of operant conditioning is really all about reward or punishment for behaviors. So how do we increase a behavior? How do we reduce a behavior? So he says in order to increase behavior, we can have positive reinforcement, which would include praise, reward, giving some type of privilege. Or we could have negative reinforcement, whereas we're still wanting the child to continue those behaviors, but we're not necessarily giving them anything, we're taking something away. So for example, no homework or a reduction in chores. Then we have the punishment side. So punishment would speak to trying to reduce behaviors. So a positive punishment might be a shaming, a scolding, or a spanking. We're giving kids some kind of attention, but it is not good attention. And then, of course, there's the punishment for negative negative punishment in order to reduce behaviors. We're trying to take away something that the students already have. So taking away free time, taking away a toy, or taking away a device. And using these positive and negative punishments and reinforcements will help us produce the kind of behavior that we want. So how does Skinner affect sixth grade, or how do those two connect? Well, children in sixth grade need lots of positive reinforcement as they're still developing intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. They still need that reward to help them stay motivated. They also need adult guidance in meeting behavioral norms and scaffolding to meet those expectations. So we have to let them know what we want from them. So a few ways that I use Skinner's strategies in my class. First of all, I employ a table point system. So within table points, students are either given points or points are taken away based on behaviors. So they can receive positive points or positive reinforcement for classroom behaviors such as participation, effort, answering questions correctly, having the materials out and ready to go. But students can also lose table points for talking out of turn, being out of their seat, being off task, doing anything that's going to disrupt the learning environment. So those are kind of a negative punishment. We also have at our school on Free Friday, or we have Free Fridays. Students have the opportunity to earn extra recess on Friday during our advisory time. So typically during advisory time, we do character education and study skills and things like that. But if students don't have any missing assignments and have come prepared to class all week, then they do not have to participate in that advisory time and are free to go outside and do what they want with their time. So it's really a negative reinforcement. We're reinforcing the behavior we want by taking away the class time of advisory. Finally, praise and feedback. So in my classroom, I'm really careful to give descriptive feedback to when students offer thoughtful commentary in class. I talk very much about what exactly it was in their response that I thought was great. I highlight logical thinking and really try to promote the thinking about the thinking that students do in class. So finally, social emotional development. And with social emotional development, I did choose to focus on the early adolescent aspects and milestones of that. So children at this age are really struggling with identity. Who are they in terms of themselves? Who are they in terms of the people around them? And it's that struggle that drives a lot of middle school and sixth grade behaviors. So they're developing their self-esteem based on outside perceptions. They're developing a moral understanding. So pro-social behavior is involved in that. Different types of cultures are involved in that to describe moral behaviors. They're developing their ideas about religion. Parent and child relationships are starting to change a little bit, again, as children are becoming a little more wanting of autonomy. Friendships are becoming very important. So their friendships are changing. It's influencing their social emotional development. They're developing cliques and crowds. Popularity is important, and developing an online presence. And last but not least, they're beginning to develop romantic relationships. And again, in sixth grade, this is something that we really don't see until much later in the year. At the beginning of the year, you have one or two who are maybe a little further advanced than the majority, but the majority are not concerned with this until later in the year. So Erik Erikson's psychosocial development theory really built off of Freud's theory of psychosexual development, in which you needed to move from one crisis to the next of that age stage in order to progress to the next stage of social development. So Erickson identified 8 stages: infancy, early childhood, preschool, middle childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle age, and old age. And really pointed to some different crises that were involved in those specific stages and what the number one influence was for those crises. So when we're looking at middle school, we're looking at going from middle childhood to early adolescence. So industry versus inferiority, developing those those self-esteem um, ideas about themselves and what they're good at and what they're not good at, but then also moving into this identity crisis. Who am I? Who am I as a person? Who am I in this group? Who am I? So here's where students, middle schoolers and sixth graders, really start to develop who they are. What are their specific character qualities, both positive and negative? And negative character qualities can stick with them for years. So it's important that we help guide them through this area. Honestly, this is probably my favorite aspect of dealing with middle school students is helping guide them into a positive identity association. So in order to help them deal with their identity crisis, I think it's important that we engage them in character education. I like to do this through modeling for them, and involving them in service learning. I think service learning is one of the most influential things that you can do with early adolescence to help them start to develop empathy and sympathy for others. I like to highlight their strengths, what I think they're really great at, and then encourage them to see themselves with a growth mindset, that even if they have some things that they're not great at right now, we can work on those things and become better. I encourage a positive identity associations and reinforce the ability to resolve negative qualities. And I attempt to show them that they can do anything they want and that their future is full of possibilities. The picture to the right is a celebration that these two girls actually started at my school. We celebrate World Down Syndrome Day, where students wore lots of socks to represent an extra chromosome for children with Down syndrome. These two girls led uh, that movement and collected the money and were able to turn it over to our Family Connections group local to Irmo. So again, a few of the activities and strategies that I use to help students develop their sense of identity. Again, through service learning, I involve them in as many opportunities as I can to help them give back. Some projects I've done in the past, and I try to connect these projects deeply with the content that we're learning through science, is Oxfam Hunger Banquet. So students are learning about food and growing food and plants. And this is one of the ways that we can give back and connect it with that. The World Down Syndrome Day, we've already talked about that one. We do food drives. We do TerraCycling, which is kind of a reusing of trash items. So we're keeping trash out of landfills, and then we're reusing those resources for other things. We do an endangered species project, and we do a Do One Thing global warming project where students talk with global partners about what's something that they can do to reduce their impact on global warming. Next, again, I encourage a growth mindset with my students all the time. How can we take maybe what's a negative and take it more as something that we can grow on? So I try to help them see that with perseverance, they can do anything, and it keeps them from identifying things as a failure and associating with that negative aspect of their personality. And then finally, career exploration. So in my class, I give them the opportunity to investigate any science career that they want. It's their choice, so that relates to their autonomy. And they create a short presentation about that career. So because they're in such an early age of adolescence, an early stage of identity crisis, this project just really serves as a way to broaden their awareness of science careers, and see that there's lots and lots of options out there. So, Kohlberg's theory on morality, um, I probably had to read this theory several times because it was shocking to me that Kohlberg was suggesting that middle school students, sixth grade students, really could only operate at the level one, stage one or two, in which they were only really kind of thinking about punishment avoidance and gaining rewards when it came to morality, which I can see to a degree, but I feel like this was, and apparently this was the case, that this was assumption underestimates the moral development of early adolescents, because they actually are able to differentiate between good and bad, and what's fair and what's not fair. So to say that they would be only at level one, stage one or two would be really an underestimation. In some ways, they can move on up to knowing that morality is about social expectations, but not only that, but about societal law and what's right and what's wrong. So, again, this is one of my most favorite things to work with adolescents on. I try to work with them a lot on developing a sense of morality. I try to serve as a model to show them how to treat other people and how we should inspire inclusion. That being said, I think it's also important to remember that kids, while they're beginning to recognize morality and the need to do something right, many of them have not developed enough to move past the simple rewards and consequences. So we still should have those available to the students who have not reached that level or are struggling and developing that level, so that we can reward appropriate behavior and punish behavior that is inappropriate. I show two pictures on the right, and I want to speak to those pictures for just a minute because the one child that is in the Super Mario Brothers shirt, he was on the autism spectrum, as well as had a lot of difficulty relating to his peers. And he started out the beginning of the year just really being a behavior problem and a distraction for all the students. By the end of the year, the students across sixth grade had almost adopted this child as their best friend. Everybody wanted to be friends with him. They had a birthday party for him. He had never had any kids come to his birthday party. And I think this speaks a lot to the work that, first of all, sixth graders are capable of, but second of all about the adult modeling of appropriate behavior. So, some strategies for producing moral thought and development in the classroom. Obviously, conflict resolution practice. In advisory class, that's where we do a lot of our character ed development. So I have a box in which students can write down scenarios, conflict scenarios that they don't know how to resolve. And they can submit those anonymously, and then each week I will pull one or two of those scenarios out of the box, and we will sit down. We'll talk about them as a class and kind of popcorn out ideas of how we could maybe attempt to resolve the conflict. And then we'll divide up into small groups, and I will let the students come up with kind of act out how they could have resolved that specific conflict. So we're dealing with conflicts that kids choose, and I'm giving them a chance to help resolve them with guided instruction. Then reflective thinking. So after any major summative assessment, I give students time to reflect on their behavior over the unit and their results on that assessment. What they could have done that maybe led to a positive result, or what they may have done that led to a negative result. they cannot do this without specific guidance. So each time we do this, we go over one of the questions together, and I model out again with my document camera what are some things that I could have done, or what are some things that are possible that students do that produce positive or negative assessment results. And then they're given time to work on that individually. And again, speaking to the role modeling aspect, I focus on thinking aloud a lot. So I often say to myself, well, I wonder what I should do about this, or I wonder I wonder how somebody might feel if I did this, or I wonder how it might feel if I had a disability. So having those wonder out louds kind of helps model some of the thinking that students need to do as they're making decisions and weighing out risk versus reward. So, in conclusion, I absolutely adore teaching sixth grade. The progression from middle childhood to early adolescence is a challenging time for kids. It can be a confusing time for adults who are trying to support kids as they grow through that. They don't know how to interact with children at this stage because they tend to look more advanced than they are. While their bodies are beginning to take on the form of adults, cognitively and social emotionally, they are still developing adult skills. I hope that by employing developmentally appropriate practices, I'm able to guide children into adolescence and provide them with the tools they need to ensure success. I found this quote about children and adolescence, and I thought it was extremely appropriate for this. The needs of children during adolescence are particular and acute. They need an opportunity to develop a sense of identity and to maintain the sense of security that emanates from group acceptance. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Have a wonderful evening.